Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the American Cinematheque online discussion for Cosmos. I'm Gwen Deglise, head programmer for the Cinematheque, and I'd like to invite you to visit our website, americancinematheque.com, where you will find the latest information on our virtual screening, our online Q&A, the Cinematheque podcast, and our latest adventure, Screening at the Drive-In. I would like to invite you tomorrow to join us for a discussion with Josephine Decker for our film Shirley. I would like to thank National Geographic. For the past 4 years, the American Cinematheque has been presenting a program with National Geographic at the Aero Theater, and I'm very grateful that we are able to bring it online this year. Our audience has been able to view episode of Life Below Zero, Barskins, and Cosmos, and for Cosmos, an episode from the 80s. So a big thank you to National Geographic. Those shows are available on National Geographic channel. And we will be taking questions from the audience. You can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type your question anytime. I encourage you to start as the conversation starts. We will be taking the question from the audience. I would like now to welcome our host for this afternoon, the creator of Cosmos, Ann Druyan, and our moderator for this afternoon, the host of the Talk Nerdy, Cara Santa Maria. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you so much for having us. All right, I'm really excited to have a chat with you today, Anne. You're just such an inspiration. It was exciting being able to watch an episode from the original Cosmos series. And maybe for just a tiny bit of clarification, in case if anybody's confused about the progression. When Cosmos first came out in 1980, it was released as Cosmos, A Personal Voyage on PBS. Then in 2014, we were blessed with Cosmos, A Space-Time Odyssey. And now on both National Geographic and soon Fox, we have Cosmos, Possible Worlds. But for this event, we got to watch an episode of Cosmos, A Personal Voyage. And specifically, we watched One Voice in the Cosmic Fugue. So the first thing I have to know from you, Anne, what was it like going back 40 years in time and rewatching something that you created that was so near and dear to so many people's hearts?
It's so good to be with you, Cara. It was a thrill, really. It was actually a great relief, too, to look back at a show that Carl and Steve Soder and I made 40 years ago, and to realize that there wasn't a single scientific misstatement after 40 of the most eventful years in the history of science. But moreover, the values of Cosmos, the fact that human evolution, that sequence, ends on a proud woman standing there. The idea that our Japanese sequence about the evolution of the Heike crab, shot in Japan with Japanese actors, directed by a man named Richard Wells, so authentic, respectful. You know, there wasn't a cringe in the whole hour. And of course, the divine Carl Sagan. I actually tears welled up because the sequence in Kew Gardens was, we shot that on my 30th birthday. And I just turned 71. So to look back on all the intervening decades and to have worked on something that stands up and is of enduring value, and to work with the great Carl Sagan, wow. All I can say is wow.
Whenever I have the honor of hearing you speak and really dive into these beautiful memories, I'm reminded not just about the love that you had for Carl and still have, but also about the kind of respect and the working relationship that the two of you had. You know, in doing a little bit of research, I realized, okay, Cosmos came out in 1980, but you guys got married in 1981. So I'm definitely interested in how that relationship blossomed and how it was interwoven with your work.
The two were completely inextricable, and there was no dividing line between work and joy. It was all the same thing. We met in 1974 and worked together on a project that was stillborn, a kind of children's Cosmos for the Children's Television Workshop, which never was produced. But it was during that period, 1975, 76, that we had the experience of thinking together. And it was so joyful. It was like being two sea mammals, you know, moving through the ocean together with that kind of a oneness and a complementarity that was so beautiful. And so by the time that the opportunity to create the Voyager Interstellar Message came along, Carl asked me to be the creative director of that project. And we collaborated on that. And then the moment we finished the Voyager record, and by that time had fallen deeply in love, and we're now together 24/7, we embarked on the first Cosmos. And what a feast of ideas. Astronomer Steve Soter was our collaborator, and the three of us traveled to some 60 locations around the world, very often writing some of the most memorable passages, you know, on set. Well, just the very last minute, you know, people are waiting for us. We had never done anything like that before. And yet, here we are, 40 years later, and it still has something to say to us.
And looking back, I mean, at the episode that we had the opportunity to watch, One Voice in the Cosmic Fugue, it strikes me really in a way, this episode is a microcosm of the entire series. You know, Carl was an astronomer. He was a physicist, but Cosmos was so much more than the story of the universe, the story of space. There was always a beautiful balance between our own deep personal relationship with the cosmos. So, you know, this episode specifically, there was very little physics in it. It was mostly biology, chemistry. You know, we talked about molecular machines and DNA. How did you guys strike that balance, especially given that that really wasn't the background of the participants, the people who made the show?
Well, I have to say, you know, my bias has already been declared, but Carl was the most learned person I've ever known. He had the most completely wide-ranging curiosity and hunger for knowledge, whether it was the religious traditions of the world or biology. And he was he could have been a biologist. He was a real student of biology. His fascination with the origin of life had brought him to the subject. And he studied with the great biologists of the 20th century, all part of this interest in understanding how life came to be on this world and what it might be like on other worlds. And so, you know, he was always being criticized actually by his academic colleagues for being wildly interdisciplinary. But in fact, if you're earthbound, you can silo biology, chemistry, physics, botany, all of these things. You can put them in their separate silos. But once you want to become a citizen of the cosmos and to begin to explore other worlds, there has to be a great scientific collaboration of all the fields working together. You wouldn't go to explore Mars and leave the geologist and the biologist or the astrobiologist home. That would be foolish. And so Carl was in the vanguard of that, as he was in so many things. And, he was editor of the first interdisciplinary journal in the history of the world. It was the first place where a geologist could collaborate with a biologist and an astronomer. And so that's one of the many walls that he was able to tear down.
So it was in you guys all along. And of course, it came out so beautifully through Cosmos, the first series, and even up to today. This, you might dial in thinking that you're just going to learn about the vastness of the cosmos.
Right.
Of course, you walk away knowing so much more about yourself and your place within it. It's interesting you mentioned that so much, basically the entire episode and the whole series really holds up when you watch it now 40 years later. But of course, there are the new iterations of Cosmos for kind of an audience today. And I'm wondering, what was the rationale behind reimagining the series, and how do you think the original series kind of compares to the newer series today?
Well, it's a big cosmos. There's a lot to know. And there are, even just on this tiny pale blue dot, there are so many stories that I wanted to tell. Stories that we need now. Stories of hope based on the endurance and the intelligence, the wisdom of our ancestors. Stories of how, of our ancestors who had their backs to the wall, just as we may feel now. Stories to bolster human self-esteem, to give us hope for the future, not an unrealistic, unscientific hope for the future, but an evidence-based dream of the future that we can still have. That was very much the motivation for me for this newest season of Cosmos, Possible Worlds, because yes, we're beginning to develop scenarios for knowing something about worlds at interstellar distances. Even, we're beginning to explore those worlds, to take a census of the worlds in the Milky Way galaxy. And so, of course, it worked on that level, but also Possible Worlds is also about the lost worlds of this planet, the civilizations of which we know very little, as well as the world we can still have here. We take visitors to the 2039 World's Fair, New York World's Fair. And we're doing this not because we don't think that climate change, global pandemics, many different environmental depredation of every conceivable kind, the ruining of the oceans, the reefs, the rivers, the air, all that is real, it's happening right now. But science has redemptive powers for our environment. It has ways that if we use our cleverness with wisdom, we can preserve that future and even create a future for our children worthy of them. And so that's what inspired me to do this newest season with my collaborator, Brandon Braga, and 985 other people all around the world working on this one season of Cosmos, as well as writing the companion book of the same name. Oh, you have
it right here.
Oh, I'd love to know, Cara. I'd love to inscribe it to you.
Oh,
I think I'll just send you one because
so kind.
I really like talking with you.
And guys, yeah, I wanted to make sure I had it next to me so that you knew that there is a beautiful and very deep companion book that accompanies the newest series, Cosmos Possible World, so that you can read along as well as watching. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this right now, but you may have already had the opportunity to watch on National Geographic, but starting on Tuesday, September 22nd at 8 o'clock on Fox, Cosmos Possible Worlds is going to air. And Anne, you mentioned this is exactly 40 years after the original Cosmos premiered on PBS.
Yes, this fall, it will be 40 years. And remember, I'd like to just remind our audience that what that moment was like in American history, because we were just about, so it premiered September 30th, 1980. We were only 6 weeks away from electing a president who would rip the solar panels that Jimmy Carter had placed there off the White House roof. A man who was so proud of his ignorance that he said trees cause pollution. And so we were going a little bit against the grain with Cosmos, which was completely respectful of the world's cultures and not, anthropocentric, let alone chauvinistic in any way. And so the country was just about to make another terrible mistake and to turn away from reality, from nature, for a kind of fear-based mythology that has cost us so much. It cost us those intervening 40 years. We were warning about climate change in 1980 in episode 4 of Cosmos. And here we are 40 years later. We don't have another 40 years to fritter away. We have to really get serious about it now.
And that is one of the things that for me was most salient when I was revisiting the first season, was that you and Carl have never been afraid. You've never shied away of being very honest about the moral, the ethical, and yes, the political relationship that science has in our culture. I think that oftentimes in science communication, individuals have a fear of getting into anything political. Oh, science is apolitical. I'm going to give you the facts. You can do with them what you want to. But there was always a point of view that I think was so meaningful and spoke to me as a social justice advocate, as an activist, that knowing about our origins and also thinking about where we might be in the future is contingent on understanding the ills of society. How did you guys weigh that? What was your kind of editorial policy with these kinds of topics?
Well, back then with Carl, we were extremely like-minded. And we had certain issues, in fact, the only arguments, the only real fights we ever had were two political differences. And we were together for 20 years. We worked together 7 days a week. And there were only 2 issues that stood out. I won't go into those, but it was like I think one of the reasons that we were arrested repeatedly at the Nevada nuclear test site to protest the continued testing during the Reagan administration, a nuclear weapon was exploded beneath our feet while we were being arrested. And because I think if you look at the pale blue dot, you can pretend to yourself that is neutral, politically neutral, and has no implications in terms of our conduct. But to me, it's just irresistible to really see our true circumstances, to see that tiny planet, so small, a single pixel, and then to pretend that this does not have implications for the nationalist, the polluter, the fossil fuel purveyor, the people who despoil our rivers, our oceans, our air. I mean, it's almost like, it's mythic in a way to think that we are so in love with something that's an abstraction, an agreed upon fiction, money, that we're willing to destroy the things we as an organism need to live, our air, our rivers, our oceans, our land, the other species. We're just part of this tree. We're not the top of the tree. And that was clear even in 1980. So yeah, I think there are certain implications. I think you can't recognize how that it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the Arctic. Several days in this last few months. how can you pretend? That wasn't supposed to happen until 2040. It's time to wake up.
And of course, you know, we think of some of the real stressors that society is experiencing right now. And I think sometimes when we live in the moment, we forget that anti-science sentiment, that lack of preparation for a global pandemic, that issues like basic human rights, civil rights, social justice, this is not new. It was
No.
just as relevant then as it is in your new series. But one thing that you, I think, have done so beautifully is to carefully look at issues that oftentimes, when we describe a historical stance within the sciences, which is just as privy, I think, to some of the inequities in our society as any field has been. For example, one example I would like to bring up is the idea of flinging ourselves into other areas of the cosmos, right? We talk about our planet and what would happen, what will happen when our planet is no longer habitable. Is there an opportunity to go elsewhere? But you've always done such a beautiful job of balancing the awe and the wonder of exploration with a real critical eye on colonialism, with a real concern about thinking as if there's a planet B and we shouldn't take care of planet A.
Thank you so much. I really hope that's true, because you know, the way I feel about it, I'm fascinated by space exploration. I'm fascinated, you know, the Voyagers and all of this the robotic missions since then completely fill me with awe. God, you know, those engineers, they could predict flawlessly where the moon of another planet would be 11 years from now and rendezvous. Just, I mean, we are good at this. But as far as human crews on spacecraft, if I was the Earth, I'd say, you get your act together, you clean up your room, and then you get to go to those other worlds. Until then, you could just send robots. Like, when I think of Mars or these other planets, and I think of these guys, it's like, think it's just another opportunity for their toys, and also to brand and to acquire wealth. I feel a shudder, actually. Here, you know, talk of the Space Force. I remember when we were doing Cosmos, that the dream was that we wouldn't extend our sickness into the cosmos, that we would not repeat the horrors of what happened when one half of this planet discovered the other half. And so I don't think we're ready. We shouldn't be allowed out, Cara. We're not ready. We haven't grown up. A grown-up is someone who takes care of other people and who takes care of business in a way which doesn't hurt other people. That's what a grown-up is. We're not there yet. And so I personally just feel like we're not hopeless. We're in our technological adolescence. And when I was an adolescent, I was a screaming hot mess. And no one would have predicted for me the amazing, thrilling, gratifying life that I've had when I was an adolescent. So we just have to get through this technological adolescence as a civilization and a species, and then we'll be ready to go traveling.
Hear, hear. Well, that, I think, leads me beautifully into opening up some of the audience questions, because the very first question that I want to ask you, I think, piggybacks right on what we were talking about. And that is, which of the recent space programs and discoveries do you think that your late husband, Carl Sagan, would have been most excited about?
God, I think about that that's a great question. I think about that almost nightly. And, there's some things I wouldn't even have the heart to tell him that have happened since his death. It would just be too depressing. And he would be in too much pain if he knew. But I think he would be thrilled with the verification and detection of gravitational waves. He would be delirious about the discovery of thousands of exoplanets circling other suns. And in that episode of Cosmos that we just saw, One Voice in the Cosmic View, 1980, Carl and Steve and I wrote, and Carl spoke, that we believe that there are countless worlds circling other suns. That was 15 years before the detection of the first extrasolar planet. And so, just listening to it with these, knowing what's happened since, I think we just, I don't think I'll ever see Carl again, but in this beautiful fantasy, we would stay up all night long. And I would be telling him, about so many different things. And not only that, but how beautifully our children have grown, and the grandchildren that he never saw and would have adored. I just, what a thought.
On that note, are there any special memories, an audience member asks, any special memories from working on the masterpiece that you'd like to share?
Oh, I know this sounds like a cop-out because I don't want to just gush all throughout this whole thing and just be, but I just realized, that the thing you learn when you lose someone who you adore is that as much as you were telling each other every day how finite life is, and we were painfully conscious of this. We tried to live every day and night together with this awareness of how short life is. But, if you're with someone you love right now, and maybe they leave their socks on the floor, don't even think about it. Just pick up the socks yourself. Don't worry, because the sheer life is so short. And even though we had 20 years together, my deepest regret is that I don't have the data access, the data retrieval access to access every day and night of those 20 years. I knew at the time it was just unbelievably, it's like a dream. So yeah, there were a lot of all-nighters. There were a lot of moments when one of us would have an idea that the other liked, and I'm sitting in the same house that we lived in. I'm looking out the window at a place where I could see Carl sitting outside. He'd love to work outside. If his answer is too long, just tell me, Cara.
No, not at all. This is what I want to hear.
He'd love to work outside. I would watch him. I'd be writing, and I'd see him sitting outside down by a little waterfall. And one time he was so intent on what he was doing that he didn't realize that a deer had walked up and was standing right behind him, looking over his shoulder, what is this guy doing? He hasn't moved. And of course, that was before cell phone cameras were everywhere. And I wished I could have taken that picture because it looked really like the deer was reading what Carl was writing. It was wonderful. Every minute. All the way to heaven is heaven, and I think of producing, writing, directing with Brandon Braga, this new series, getting up, at 4:00 in the morning to write the book, and be on set at 7, and just that whole, even the things you don't really like doing are really wonderful. And if we could live that way with that kind of joy, that would be the best.
Oh, You know, one of the things that I think was so beautiful and continues to be so beautiful about the series is that you are able to offer the audience a visualization of things that either we don't yet have the capability to visualize, or we may never because they're historical things or they're metaphorical visualizations. And so one audience member asks, and I love this, if you were granted one wish to see a celestial object anywhere in the universe, what would you choose?
Could it be a celestial event also?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I really would love to. Everybody, this is the cliche, but I would love to see the Big Bang. I would love to understand it because it just seems so counterintuitive that the entire universe, all of those billions of galaxies with hundreds of billions of stars, were once compressed into something roughly the size of a ping pong ball. It's just too much, you know? And so I'd love to see that, but I do feel on this new season, I know this sounds self-referential, that Jeff Oken, who was our visual effects supervisor, he showed me something that I have always wanted to see and which moves me so deeply. And that is the sun turning on and the first world, Jupiter, coalescing out of the accretion disk of gas and dust that surround the newborn star and beginning to forge its lane, its orbital lane around the sun. And Jeff, who created VFX shots, not for 20 seconds, you know, but for 3 and 4 minutes long, you know, shots that Brandon and I and our colleagues, you know, would vet some 50 iterations of each shot. Andre Barmanis making sure the science was right. You know, it was just, I mean, it was wonderful to see so many people pulling together and then bringing forth a vision of nature, of the majesty of nature, using those VFX not to blow up cars, not to blow up buildings, but to create verisimilitude of the grandeur and power and beauty and truth of nature. Yeah, so I would like to see the Big Bang, though, if that was a possibility.
So that kind of brings me, and I'm so sorry, audience, but it made me think of a question that I'd love to ask that I haven't seen yet from the audience questions. And that really has to do with the voice of the show, right? There's something about Cosmos that's different than everything on television. It's got a poetic, in some ways, a slower, more methodical, deeper, you know, very, very emotional tone to it. And of course, in many ways, you think about just the way that Dr. Sagan spoke and his voice really just flowed out through your beautiful writing. The newer seasons, it's no longer Carl, now it's Neil deGrasse Tyson. And in some ways, there's a lot of similarity between the two, but in other ways, these are wildly different men. So I'm wondering, how were you able to maintain the voice, but also tailor it to Dr. Tyson?
You know, we really didn't tailor it to Neil, although Neil gives a totally great performance. But Brandon and I, we're not tailoring it to Neil at all. It was the voice of Cosmos. And it was the voice that Carl and Steve Soder and I, you know, together invented back in 1980. And I think I can say this, that Carl was a person who had equal measure of skepticism and wonder both. Never one at the expense of the other. Loved life, loved fun, loved, you know, sports, loved, you know, was just in love with life. And so I think it's that voice that we created together with Steve. That is the voice of Cosmos still, I hope. And it is that you don't have to give up that spiritual uplift, that joy of life, in order to choose an evidence-based vision of nature. You can have both. You must have both. And I think that's what distinguishes Cosmos, is that sense of the romance of life without resorting to cheating or the supernatural, always sticking to what we know about nature, but still hoping to raise goosebumps wherever we can.
So then that, of course, leads me to another audience question, which is, what really made you decide that it was the right time for another Cosmos series? I mean, this new one is 2020. The previous was 2014. So that's a big gap between 1980 and 2014. What was the trigger for you to say, I think it's time?
Well, actually, I first thought it was time, in 2008. Had collected a whole bunch of new stories to tell that hadn't been told in the first season, but also, and did that with Steve Soter, and also, wanted to use the unrivaled explanatory power of the cosmic calendar, of, various, the ship of the imagination, because I felt that there was an antipathy towards science, a pulling away from reality, a turning away from what we know is happening, and a kind of contempt for science, which really reached new heights not seen in hundreds of years with the current administration. But in 2008, I started, Steve and I and our partners and Neil, because I always knew Neil was the kind of scientist who could connect, and not only that, but who could communicate his love of science through his bearing and the way he is. And so we went around, and it wasn't until I met Seth MacFarlane that it was possible to do season 2. And when season 2 was done in 2015, Brandon and I took some little time off, and I started having a vision of what possible worlds could be. I stole the title from a great scientist and writer named Bernal, who had written a book, 80 years ago. And it always struck me, possible worlds, what a promise to make. And it was a very different kind of book, but that was my inspiration. I wanted to make the case for science and to stand up, but also to make the case for the future and for what we can still do, how we can get our act together right now.
I love that. There's a question here that I think is a really important question. It's one that speaks to me personally, and I hope it speaks to you as well. From an audience member, she asks, you've had a very successful scientific career, and I was wondering, what advice would you give to a young woman wanting a career in cosmology? Or I'd even broaden that in science communication, STEM fields in general.
Well, actually, I haven't had a scientific career. I only play one on TV. No, I actually was
You're self-taught is what you are.
I'm an autodidact, yeah. Not just self-taught, but I had this 20-year, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week tutorial. I could turn to the man next to me and ask any question fearlessly, because there was no such thing as a stupid question. And then probably one of the greatest teachers of the last 1,000 years would answer that question. And then we'd be off on a whole new writing session. So I'm not a scientist. I never got to even finish a sentence until I was like 32 in a meeting. I come from a time when women were ridiculed, chronically demeaned, insulted. So, what I would say to any woman who would let's say you are interested in cosmology, follow your bliss is the greatest thing that you can do with your life, because life is daily. And in order to really make it fun and to maintain interest, do what you love to do. And I consider myself the luckiest of people, not just for knowing Carl and loving him and being loved by him, but also because I got my daytime job was also my passion. Now, I had a lot of jobs before I got that daytime job that I loved in order to support myself. And so I knew I got a really good taste of what it's like to be doing something you don't like, which is, that's life too.
Yeah.
But if you're young and starting out and you have the freedom to follow your bliss, don't let anybody stop you. Don't let anybody intimidate you or make you feel unworthy. Just keep going.
Oh, it's beautiful. And on that note, I mean, here's another really beautiful question. What do you think? So an audience member asks, what do you think I could do to actively participate and help spread the powerful message of human unity the cosmos brings?
Wow. Well, the person who asked that question already is already doing it. It's kind of meta. How do you do that? I just think there are a million ways. Every single day affords us the opportunity to be kind, to be thoughtful, to learn, and to have less of a footprint, a carbon footprint, and to be, like it says in the Bible, to love mercy, do justice, walk humbly. These are the things, these are the values at the heart of Cosmos and so many other belief systems. And all I can say is, educate yourself. Because if you know something deeply, you have a great power. And that's once you have that, people will listen to you about the thing you know deeply, but they may also listen to you about other things as well.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's a big subject. That was a big question, but a beautiful one.
I just get teared up listening to you, speak your truth. And I think on that note, there's one, not a question, but a comment from an audience member that I have to read before we move on. This comes from somebody in New Zealand who says, "Dear Anne, thank you, and Steve and Carl for being my extra set of parents, my intellectual, scientific, creative parents who taught me to love the cosmos with all my being and look at it with wonder every day on every scale."
Oh, wow.
I know.
That is, wow. Thank
all
you.
the feels. Yeah.
What'd you say?
I said all the feels. Who knew?
Yeah, it's all the feels.
Yeah.
It's all the feels. And God, that's such a beautiful thought. I cherish that. Who was their name?
Carlos.
Carlos, thank you. Thank you so much from my heart. Really.
And I think it really does encapsulate what so many people feel deep in their hearts. What so many of people have told me, just working as a science communicator, how important Cosmos was to them. I've learned that this was the quintessential story that drew a generation into science, and now a new generation is following. And I think on that note, and it's time now for me to thank you so much for all the time that you've spent. And we're going to move on now to watching a trailer of the newest series. Again, Cosmos Possible Worlds. You're going to see a trailer of the series that you'll be able to watch starting September 22nd at 8:00 on Fox. And oh my gosh, thank you so much. This was a joy.
Cara, I love talking with you. I think we need to do a podcast together or something. I'm up for it. I just want you to know, and to everyone who is watching and to the Cinematheque, Thank you so much for the honor of being with you tonight. Thank you.
We were hunters and foragers. The frontier was everywhere. We were bounded only by the earth and the ocean and the sky. The open road still softly calls, like a nearly forgotten song of childhood. Despite our limitations and fallibilities, we humans are capable of greatness. How far will our nomadic species have wandered by the end of the next century and the next millennium? Who will we become in the far future?
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Cara, for this very inspiring and beautiful conversation. Thank you, the audience, for zooming in. This conversation will be on our YouTube channel sometimes tomorrow. You're welcome to share it and spread it with the world.